Hello, I'm Dan Cook with BoneZone. Welcome to our webinar on the ways new implant designs capitalize on cementless knee movement, presented by Orchid Orthopedic Solutions. Orchid is a global contract manufacturer and orthopedic technology developer. The company provides end-to-end manufacturing for full knee constructs and scalable production of cementless cobalt chrome and titanium knee components. Orchid has experience in anti-wear technologies and bone ingrowth and on-growth solutions through sintering, plasma spray, and 3D printing. Joining me this morning for the panel discussion are Celeste Johnny, Product Innovation Engineering Manager at Orchid, Matthew Schomper, Principal Engineer at Not a Robot Engineering, and Trey Rogers, Research Principal Engineer 2 at Zimmer Biomet. Each panelist will briefly discuss their background and advancements in cementless knee implants. We'll then get together for a group discussion before taking questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your inquiries at any time during the talk, and we'll hopefully get them answered. Before we get started, I'd like to touch on a few trends in cementless knees. It is now used in 20% of all primary total knee replacement procedures, according to the American Joint Replacement Registry annual report. Zimmer Biomet reports that the global cementless knee replacement market is expected to exceed $14.7 billion by 2030. Smith & Nephew estimates that cementless knees represent a $400 million opportunity in the US. And in 2022, Stryker marked its 1 millionth cementless knee procedure. Some big names in the industry have also commented on the trend. Ivan Tornos says that Zimmer Biomet is committed to driving the penetration of cementless knees into the 50 to 60% range at a rapid pace. Kevin Lobo said the synergy between cementless knees and Stryker's Mako robot is significant. And Dr. Edith Lombardi, a joint replacement specialist out of Ohio and a well-known personality in orthopedics, believes that cementless knees will account for at least half of knee replacements in the coming years. With that, hopefully providing some context for today's talk, I'd like to hand it over to Trey.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate you and team and Orchid for the invitation to share today. I'd like to take a quick moment, I guess, and just highlight why many of us are likely in the field and on this call because of our product's positive impact on patient lives. As a company, our goal is to alleviate pain and improve the quality of life for people around the world. And this isn't just our patients, but whole families and communities that benefit from our devices. Our products offerings have blessed people I personally know and love, and I've seen firsthand the huge difference in quality of life. And I think this is probably the context for why cementless is ultimately being pursued. Regarding Zimmer Biomet, I believe we're still #1 in hip and knee markets globally, and our company was founded almost 100 years ago. We're in operations in 25 countries and selling product in over 100 countries. Regarding our offering, we have our G7 OsseoTi cup shown there, and it's been on the market for about 10 years. We've had many cementless implant options across multiple joints historically that have included cementless, and at some point, I think we've probably had nearly every major type of bone ingrowth material as an offering. Recently, we've made a concerted effort to focus on data-driven solutions, including robotics and augmented implantation techniques and tracking patient recoveries through data and applications in smartwatches. And I think the goal here is to help surgeons with implant selection, implant precision, ultimately improving patient outcomes. We also offer the only smart knee implant and have custom shaped implants as well. Our newest cementless offering is the Persona Cementless OsseoTi Knee, which is being extremely well received in the market. And I think the design philosophy here to highlight is that we're focusing on stability, surgical flexibility, and anatomic fit. Stability is driven largely by the press fit feature optimization and our OsseoTi porous metal lattice for biological fixation with the bone. And the versatility comes down to similar bone prep between our cemented and cementless tibial keel designs, so the surgeon can decide at the last moment based on bone quality which way to go. And the anatomic fit of the Persona system has to do with our large catalog of actual patient bone model data that went into the high coverage side and size specific tray shapes to get all the way out to the cortical wall. Some specific other advantages of cementless knee that I guess we're seeing as well in the market includes decreased OR time due to not having to mix and wait for cement to cure, and a growing appreciation for the long-term fixation value that bone ingrowth can provide. We've had surgeons that started out very hesitant to adopt our cementless offering that started using it and quickly grew in confidence in usage. So transitioning a little bit as to how I help in our company, I've been in a corporate headquarter research role for the last 11 years, and I act a bit like an internal consultant for different biomaterials and advanced technology platforms. And for about the last 8 or 9 years, I've been primarily supporting our additive manufacturing or 3D printing technologies. I actively engage with new product introduction teams, primarily helping our development and manufacturing groups navigate their usage of AM, taking folks that are very unfamiliar with it up to a higher level of usage, or helping people and directing them with early stage prototyping, which selection of AM they might be using, post-processing, fatigue and process characterization, testing of the lattice, FDA guidance document compliance, marketing, et cetera. So ultimately, this involves me helping our cross-functional teams with their regulatory submissions and then post-market investigations. And I have found it very engaging and a rewarding position. I've had the privilege of being able to see a lot of what happens from all the way to the very beginning stages to the very end stages, designed to implementing in the field. This does come with some challenges, though. We're a large company, it's a complex global industry, and there are many stakeholders involved. Because of this, a significant part of my job has been kind of an internal and external networking job and the development and sharing of best practices. Regulatory bodies, I would highlight just the FDA in particular, have increased their focus on how we characterize and test additively manufactured parts. While the FDA doesn't specifically clear a manufacturing process, for example, like an additively manufactured Ti-6-4 on a specific laser powder bed fusion machine, but rather they clear a specific device. So the risk of the device, the risk of the process that is employed to make it, both heavily influence how we have to challenge our devices in our DHFs. And the FDA provides guidance on how we, as OEMs, decide to execute our quality control and device use strategies. With that, I think I'll pass it over to Matt Schomper.
Thanks, Trey. And I also wanted to say thanks to the team for inviting me, and really excited to be able to chat about the additive manufacturing and computational design role in orthopedic products in general, but specifically cementless products for large joint applications. I have less of a company to sell. My primary role right now is consulting in the space of computational design for additive manufactured orthopedic products. As you can kind of see on the screens, it's just a flavoring of several of the opportunities and privileges I've had of being able to work on products specifically on sort of digesting and reducing biomimetic type structures and or features into human use products. So over the past several years, specifically, I've given several talks on adaptations of the mantis shrimp and its specific armor for flexible products, shark skin, and its role in sort of a unidirectional friction. That was at ICAM. And at ICAM later this year, I'll be speaking to kind of the role of structural compliance in implant products and sort of what biomimetic applications that we can draw from. So what I think is fascinating here is that the growing segment for, or the sort of this desire for cementless is because of the decreasing age of population of those that are getting total knees because of factors we're more active. I personally have had a double knee surgery when I was in college, so I'm probably going to be a receiver of some knees here at some point. But this idea that the younger population has seen some premature failures in cementless products. And at the end of the day, for younger populations that can grow bone, that don't have any issues with osteoporosis, the fact is that bone growing into an implant is better than sort of a cement surrogate. With that being said, this idea that we want to match local conformance, match stiffnesses, leads to a lot of opportunity for the role of specialized design principles in additive manufacturing to be able to create structures and textures that not only conform to the local anatomy in a patient-by-patient manner, but also can directly match stiffnesses. So I'm working right now with 2 different research organizations on some projects, which hopefully papers will be this year, maybe next year, investigating which lattices grow bone better. That's something that I get asked about a lot, as well as investigating the role of sort of stiffness gradients. So with additive manufacturing, we can directly control the stiffness of a structure. We can grade that through space. And for things where we're particularly concerned with how fast can we grow bone into a space, we're really interested in a certain amount of micromotions that's going to maximize bone growth. And so being able to use all of these principles, the multi-objective solving, being able to solve for multiple different problem cases and different patients in a singular workflow is the stuff that I enjoy working on. And again, similar to echo Trey's sentiment, I get particular joy out of seeing the stuff that I've designed, that I've helped with, that I've ideated, or even just inspired, see that come to market and see it directly being going to patients to better their lives and their livelihoods. So with that, I will pass it over to Shailesh.
Thank you, Trey. My name is Shailesh Jani, and I work at Orthopedic Solutions. I've worked here now for over 12 years. Orthopedics, as during the introduction, is a full supply chain solution, from castings to forgings, all the way up to the final device. Now, my focus is mostly on the lattice structures and Orchid offerings for lattice structures or porous coatings. Even though there has been an evolution recently of utilizing additive manufacturing, even the legacy products truly are additive, because coatings are applied after the implants have already been manufactured. So the offerings we have geographically are located in 3 different places for porous structures. One is based in Memphis, where we apply all of the sintered coatings. The other 2 are in Detroit facility and in our Switzerland facility. Those facilities apply porous structures via plasma spray. So titanium coatings are applied using vacuum technologies, vacuum plasma spray, and HA is applied via atmospheric plasma spray. So historically, these coatings have worked really, really well, and the requirements for these coatings are fairly well known, right? So there are FDA's, CFRs, guidance documents, consensus standards. All of these have very specific requirements in what the lattice structure should actually look like and what its mechanical properties should be, right? So over this long time of more than 30 years of Orchid working with porous structures, we have developed our ability to satisfy those particular requirements from the regulatory side, right? And each of these technologies have benefits and drawbacks too, right? So you always, I'm working with folks like Trey at Zimmer, for instance. His role mostly is to satisfy the needs of the surgeon and the patient, and my role is to satisfy Trey's responsibilities, right? So he has certain needs that he would come to us for, right? So amongst the offerings we have, the one that is the most traditional and has the longest history of clinical use is application via sintering. And that is typically utilizes spherical beads. And then over time, it has become well established that that particular surface is relatively smooth, and early fixation, as Trey had mentioned, is very, very important. So a rough surface, which has a higher coefficient of friction against bone, became an important consideration as the sintered porous coatings developed with time, right? So we have what is known as irregular coatings. And the difference between irregular and spherical beads is literally just the shape of the powder that is utilized in the sintering process, right? So the spherical beads essentially give you a conformal surface in the boundary itself, while the asymmetric coating or the rough coatings essentially have a lot of spicules that stick out of the surface itself that give you the additional coefficient of friction. So coefficient of friction, I think, is very, very important for maintaining that early stability, right? So if you look at the coefficient of friction for spherical beads, it's typically in the range of about 0.5 or so, while for irregular beads, you can reach all the way up to 1. So essentially, the force that is needed to move the implant against bone is greater than the the normal force that's applied. So essentially what you're getting is early interdigitation between the porous lattice and the bone, right? You're not relying necessarily on biological fixation right away. You're getting much better mechanical fixation. And then there is also the additional adjunct that you can be applied directly onto an existing porous surface, and that is hydroxyapatite. So HA coatings are typically applied via plasma spray also, although there are some other methods of using wet chemistry, but that's not what we do. We apply it using plasma spray technology. Right? So all of these things have application in knees, but they also produce different challenges. An example would be anytime you apply a sintered coating, you're doing heat treatment to do the sintering process at temperatures significantly greater than the temperature where you end up getting the incipient melting is greater than that of the beta transits for titanium. So you're going to get a significant amount of grain growth. That grain growth essentially leads to weakened mechanical properties. So fatigue strength decreases, ultimate tension strength, elongation to break, all of those decrease when you do sintered coatings. And this is where folks like Trey would come in. They would have to make sure that the design itself is robust enough in terms of section thickness, so that the deficit you end up getting because of the application of sintered coatings is accounted for in the design itself. Now, for instance, if you do not want that reduction, or you do not want the extent of reduction to be quite that low, then of course you would apply it using vacuum plasma spray. Right? What vacuum plasma spray allows is that it doesn't heat up the implant quite to the same extent. So your mechanical properties are really not affected quite to the same extent as you would if you were to do sintered coatings. So recently, Orchid Orthopedics Solutions, we have entered into the additively manufactured modality, right? And the advantage of additively creating not only the implant itself, but printing the lattice structure integrally during the printing process is the fact that all of the limitations related to either sintered or plasma spray coatings are completely eliminated. Right? So an example for plasma spray, it's a line of sight process. The size of the beam is about 12 millimeters, half an inch or so. And in a knee, and especially in a knee femoral component, access can be limited by quite a bit, because just imagine you want to be able to apply a plasma beam onto the distal, not the distal, but posterior condyles. In order to access that, you may sometimes have the anterior flange that may actually shadow that region where you want to apply the coating, and vice versa. For instance, if you want to apply the coating onto the anterior flange, then there is a likelihood of some shadowing effect from the posterior condyle also. So those are all of the different challenges that are engineering challenges. There are solutions around that, but they essentially go away if you were to print the lattice structure integrally, right? Coatings using traditional sintering and plasma spray require a lot of masking so that the coating doesn't go in areas where you don't want it to go. That issue is completely eliminated when you do the 3D printing. Now, the additional trend that we have seen recently, and we get a lot of interest in this, is the fact that there is a move to moving away from cobalt chrome and using titanium as a material even for knee femoral components, because it is generally believed to be more biocompatible. Patients are less likely to be sensitive to elements in titanium than they would be to cobalt chrome. So issues like allergies and things like that are either completely eliminated or reduced to a great extent if you were to make it out of titanium. The problem there, though, is that titanium is not a great bearing material, So in order for us to be able to utilize titanium in bearing applications, the articular surface would need to be treated in addition to the printing process itself. Right? So that's where, if you look at the picture on the right, the most extreme right portion of it, you'll see a knee that is black in color. This knee was printed with the lattice structure. And subsequent to that, we applied a plasma spray ceramic coating on that. And that coating we refer to as altitude. It has a hardness that's about 1.5 times that of cobalt chrome. So essentially what that allows us to do is realize the benefits of ceramic where ceramic is needed, yet at the same time being able to continue to utilize titanium, which is less stiff than cobalt chrome and is known to be more biocompatible than cobalt chrome. And the two pictures at the bottom there is just an example of a 3D printed type 1 is what we call it, an SEM image for that, and a cross section of a very typical lattice structure that you can print using e-beam technology as an example. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to the moderators, please.
Thank you all for your insights and feedback. Appreciate it. Going to start the panel discussion now. First question is, in what ways has the trend towards cementless knees impacted, overall implant designs? And if I could throw that to Trey to start off, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think a large part of the focus is just on that direct bone contacting surface and tackling both short and long-term fixation and stability. So for the short term, we've been able to really optimize and minimize micromotion through keel and peg designs and press fit optimization. And so we have size-specific keel and spikes, and we've been able to make a progressive interference fit of the keel. And that actually results in a really strong pull-out strength. The surgeon can actually lift the table off the OR table after implanting the tibia. And over the long term, having that lattice allows the bone to ingrow into that designed porous material. And like Shailesh mentioned just a minute ago, there's a lot more freedom with AM specifically. We're able to finally make the lattice that we want. We don't have to be limited by the manufacturing process. And in many cases, previous porous materials didn't have fully interconnected pores, for example. And I think there's a common surgeon perception that the first day is the best day for cement, whereas with a porous metal, the bone ingrowth will hopefully make that fixation better over time. And I think we're seeing a trend in patients getting younger, heavier, higher expectations. Historically, we've had a 6 to 10.5% revision rate for knees at 20 years. So clearly that's not going to get better with younger, more active patients. And registry data shows specifically like with younger men, we're getting better outcomes with cementless now. So with that, we can actually make a bone mimicking cancellous structure with our metal printing process. We can get the pore size, porosity, and roughness that we want and really make that application specific. And we've had really good success with that bone lattice in our G7 cup. So it makes sense now. The last couple of years, we're seeing really good results with the knee as well. I think there's a really good surgeon presentation Dr. Adolf Lombardi has on ViewMedi. He's done like 35,000 joint replacements over the last 35 years, and he kind of outlines a lot of this if you guys want to go search for that. But a couple other quick factors, I guess, would be cortical wall coverage and fit anatomic shape. I think that's important to get good bone fixation. Revisability features, that's something that's commonly being implemented as well. If you have to remove something, then you need to be able to take off that keel potentially. We can build that in now with 3D printing. And then I guess the last major thing I'd point out is that price pressures, at least in the US, have really pushed us to being a lot more careful about manufacturing costs and surgeon efficiency in the OR. OR time is really important. So anything you can do to help streamline your OR efficiency would be helpful.
Echoing what,
go ahead.
Yeah, kind of just echoing what Trey said, we're seeing very similar trends. One of the trends that we're seeing also is that the traditional technologies, AC matrix or the rough coating that is applied by sintering would be a good example. It has porosity of, let's say, 60% and pore size of somewhere in the 320% micro range. What we're seeing is a lot of customers are asking for both the porosity and the pore size to be increased. Now, when you do that, what happens is that you're essentially creating more space and less material. So your structure can be weaker, right? So there are consensus standards that we need to test by and meet certain requirements for the FDA guidance document, right? So that's where we kind of come in, and you can increase all of those things by traditional technologies, but the only way to do that in sintering, for instance, you would increase the size of the beads that you're using. But if you do that, then you increase the thickness, right? So your lateral dimensions improve, but your thickness also improves. But then what you do is you're eating up the mechanical properties of the implant itself, because now the lattice structure is taking up more space. With 3D printing, you can independently increase the sizes of the pores in the lateral direction without increasing the thickness itself. So you get the best of both worlds. You maintain the properties of the implant itself, yet you improve upon the lattice and the pore structure.
Got it. Thank you. Shailesh, I'm going to throw this one to you. How are some of the latest developments in surface coating and structures and AM allowing orthopedic companies to bring solutions to the market that, enhance or promote bone ingrowth?
Right. So I think there the key is that, there are two factors associated with that, right? One is what kind of structure is actually going to allow for bones to grow, right? The requirements are fairly well known. They have been known for a long period of time, right? If you can get vascularization, then the likelihood of bone ingrowth is high, right? But the other thing also is implantability. So for instance, we know for a fact that a rough structure is really, really good, right? With large pore sizes and high degree of porosity. But if that implant becomes more difficult to put into the patient, because of the roughness, then you need to be able to tailor the implant porous coating specific to that particular area. So for instance, when a knee implant first gets into prepared bone, right, the abrasion that takes place is going to be between the anterior flange and the distal, not distal, but the posterior condyle, right? Because that's the entry point for the implant to go into the prepared bed of bone. So with AM, what we can do actually is to tailor the roughness to be different at the distal flat, at the chamfers and the anterior flange. You can make it graded, for instance, if you wanted to, that the entry point is relatively smooth and progressively it becomes rough. So it allows for much better structure and implantability, because both of those things are very important.
Matt, can you chime in on that?
Yeah, I think to add to that, I kind of like what Trey and Shailesh were saying with the previous question, which my only addition to that would be, saying that we are going from process-based surface textures or ingrowth features to AM specific. I think Trey, you mentioned that you're not limited by process. I'll put a little caveat there that I think in a lot of people's eyes, AM is this magic solution for we can create whatever we want to. But as somebody who's spent a lot of time in the manufacturing side, specifically for AM, especially as you start to get these crazier and crazier structure types that you want to do all this stuff, you end up getting some pretty significant limitations, from a laser-based process because of heat, or EBM because of size features that you're limited to do. So with that being said, though, to build upon what Shailesh was saying, the customization options are incredible. Like, beyond just functionally grading roughness, like what he was talking about, we can directionally control roughness. So imagine, this idea that you've got an insertion force much less than the force to be able to pull that back out by directionally controlling beams, let's say, or surface roughness from lattices. I think the other advances that we're seeing are just better tech, better process control on the AM side. So back when Stryker was first developing some of these first cementless offerings, the technologies 10 years ago versus now, when you get to like in situ monitoring, the option, like what lasers you have available, being able to monitor and or augment the process for things like making sure you're controlling your heat and really small features of size with pulse width modulation. So I think over the last 10 years, we'll continue to see those trends getting better and better for being able to increase speed, increase precision, and increase the quality. So when I see, like Trey mentioned, costs, like that's a big deal for people. And what we saw originally with AM trying to shove into the space is that it was significantly more expensive, at least in laser powder bed fusion, than anything that was available on the market. that started out as like a casting, forging, and then you added a coating to it. So being able to see the efficiency increase in AM, I think it doesn't get talked about as much because it's not cool design. Like, oh, this is fun, we get to play around with the design. But if it's not cost efficient, it could be as cool as possible, but who's going to pay for it? So I think that's worth saying, is that the advances over the last 10 years in the machine manufacturers and those that are actually performing the processes, doing the research, like what Trey's working on, have led to the ability to be able to have cementless knees and or advances in the space that would not have been possible. So Trey, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, you guys are covering a lot of the same stuff I had kind of on my bullet list too. I think there's a wide range of technologies, not just the process of putting the lattice on. So, I mean, there's things that can help your design, your manufacturing, coatings that can enable inspection processes. Like, that's not an insignificant issue. Post-processing, there's a lot of different heat treatments and hip options that are out there, for example, to improve fatigue strength if you're right up at the limit on a design. Sterilization is not an insignificant issue given the difficulties with having gamma or EO. Distribution and implantation techniques can all be improved with better data and management of systems. So any of those, if people are interested in the audience, I'd invite questions maybe for all of us at that point. But I do think one point that really stood out with my conversations with our senior development folks is just the ability to iterate designs much faster than traditional methods really led to a much better optimized outcome that we just weren't able to get to that quickly with previous generations of processing. And so they were able to really fine tune that progressive interference fit of the keel, for example, right to the point where the surgeons were really happy with that. And I think additive, like you mentioned, Matt, isn't a golden ticket. Like, you have to understand it well, and it doesn't play nice in one space. Like, it affects design, and design affects additive, and manufacturing and materials and regulatory all has different complexities to it regarding additive. So I think if you can exercise that well, it becomes a big competitive advantage. If you don't exercise it well, you can add a lot of cost. And like you kind of mentioned, Matt, you're actually kind of behind the 8 ball to start, because you start with raw material and then you atomize it. That makes it way more expensive. Then you take $1 million machine and you turn it into something that's still a raw material. So unless you can design out a lot of cost in your process or add value in your features, you probably aren't better off doing it. We've, I think, been privileged in our field with having pretty decent margins and expensive legacy processes for making lattices. So that's why out of the gate, additive has even made sense for us. But with cost pressures, like, we're going to have to keep on working on that. There's a variety of ways across the entire continuum of manufacturing to drive out cost.
Yeah, kind of echoing on the costing again. Yeah, the newer generation of at least on the e-beam side, we are now able to print much larger volumes, right? Because essentially that's all about scale. And in addition to that, if you can print, say, without any support structures, then the post-processing that's involved in an implant is significantly reduced. So essentially, yes, there is an additional cost associated with the fact that you're starting with a bar stock, atomizing it, and now using $1 million machine to do the printing. It's what happens afterwards where the cost reduction typically comes in, right? So to be able to print a lot of implants without supports that need subsequent finishing, either by machining or belting, all of those things kind of lead to not only better features, but also reduce cost at the same time.
Thank you for that. Just shifting gears slightly, what are the best ways for orthopedic companies to move their implant production to new coatings or AM modality to not only maintain their product portfolio, but potentially grow it? Shailesh, would you mind taking that one?
Yeah, so legacy products is a little bit more difficult, right? Because most of our customers have a clinical history associated with that. And they would prefer not to change the manufacturing method of a legacy product, for instance, right? But new implant designs lend perfectly well to using AM for the manufacturing process. Right? So what we do is we work intimately with the customers, right? We look at the design, we look at how readily it can be manufactured using additive manufacturing, right? And then in consultation, we essentially design builds. We design the lattice structure around what their needs are. So there are many different things that come into play. Like, for instance, one example is roughness and thickness of the coating, for instance, right? The other one in a knee femoral component or even on a tibial base plate is, should you have a rim around the lattice structure, right? So all of those things kind of get into play, and together we design the lattice structure to meet the requirement that they'll have. And the flexibility now is much greater. As Trey mentioned, you could build prototypes literally the day after you have a concept design that you want to try out, and be able to see in hand very quickly what that implant is going to look like, go through the finishing process, and if needed, take it to your key opinion leaders, the surgeons, to determine whether that's an acceptable product or something that they would like to move forward with.
So something I like to think about with this, it's similar to what Shailesh was saying. Legacy products are a lot harder, because even if somebody wanted to make the change, I'm actually working with somebody who is interested in going from a legacy coding process to AM, but they've got a lot of clinical data. It's a class 3 product. And so the FDA's primary concern is, even if you can prove this is a direct mimic or surrogate of the previous product, but you're doing it with AM now, what sort of impacts, right, biological being primary, that are going to affect your ingrowth over a 6-week period, let's say, that you've already proven through a multi-site study. So that most customers, when faced with this idea of all right, well, there's going to be regulatory challenges, are like, yeah, maybe I won't do that because it's still complicated. The FDA has still got a lot of questions about AM specific processes like particulate and its removal, cleaning, because of the porous coating. So, but speaking of new products, my question for people that ask me well, what can I do is well, what do you consider good enough? Good enough is being okay with saying, here's what's been done in the past, let's be as good as this. And I think that in that case, you can take a lattice structure that's got the porosity that Shailesh has already mentioned, that's been studied over many years. We know what pore sizes are. We know how things get vascularized, blah, 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 on. But if you look at AM specific research over the last 3 to 5 years, even, you start to look at some nuances and, okay, well, it's not just porosity, but it's also morphology. So the morphology of a surface, as studied by some great researchers at TU Delft, show that this saddle shape curvature, osteoblasts love. They love to sit on top of it. They love to build a network. It's incredibly cool from a vascularization standpoint. So when you start really diving into this, and I'm currently doing a research project right now, which I can't speak to yet, but it's do lattices actually matter? In other words, if you're making it out of titanium and you've got an appropriate pore size, is there a magic lattice that sucks bone in and grows, or does that matter? So I think, research and development efforts in this space will be super critical over the next 5 to 10 years to say, can we raise the bar from, these cementless ideas to not just throw a lattice in there that, okay, I checked the box, it's got a lattice, everyone's going to love it because it's 3D printed, but is there an opportunity to use the technologies to provide a direct benefit to the patient? Like one of Trey's very first statements opening up was how impactful these have already been in the market in general, directly on people that we know and love. And I think that to continue to raise that bar, instead of just saying we settled for it, it's good enough, we got a lattice in there, is why I'm passionate about it, to continue to create wild looking stuff, because I think that it matters, and we're going to continue to figure out where these endpoints are and how do we improve them and get better.
Yeah, and the advantage of additive manufacturing there is the fact that the cost associated with the design of a new lattice structure that is more friendly to osteoblasts, for instance, that part of it is relatively straightforward. And the printing, whether you print a standard lattice or an esoteric lattice, is about the same, right? There's no change in the cost associated with printing. The design of it might be a different story altogether. But that's where I think additive manufacturing really lends itself well to moving the esoteric designs and making them cost effective in printing, because there is no change there.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to say, well, we can center beads, but now let's try to center, like even the asymmetric bead coating that you guys have. That alone probably took years and years of development to change from just beads to something that's not a bead, or different shapes or varying sizes. So I think with AM, you sometimes get complacent and be like, well, instead of just round struts, I'm going to make square struts, because it literally costs me nothing other than to change the profile to a square.
Right.
Whereas from developing a process to be able to do that would have, like, yeah, you're right, would have taken orders of magnitude longer.
Right.
Last question from me, guys, before we take some questions from the audience, which are rolling in. What economic or regulatory risk factors should be considered when implementing AM and cementless knees? Trey, if I could throw that to you, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think probably you can fill in a lot of the dots that we've been all talking about in terms of giving yourself more time to iterate and optimize your AM process. That will probably help you drive a lot of the cost out. I agree with you, Shailesh. Most of the cost in AM is really in your post-processing. Printing your blank is one part of it. And so if you get stuck in having to machine something that you didn't think you were going to have to machine, that's a lot of extra operations and touching of the part. And in terms of the regulatory risk, I think that's probably something that's most in my awareness right now, just because the FDA has really increased their level of expectations for what it takes to characterize additively manufactured implants. And I think that's warranted, because we're making something that's not like a casting, it's not like a forging, and it does have an anisotropic microstructure that's very different to other materials. And stacking up millions of weld pool lines in high speed can create quite a bit of variation between different machines and laser parameters. And so the FDA, I think, has increased their expectations on OEMs and manufacturers to understand their process, sources of variation, and how it affects end-level properties of fatigue. And we've been actively starting to present some of these findings that we've had internally this year, and got a talk at ICAM later, and we've already had some other talks earlier this year that really kind of show that there's challenges with some of our static property control strategies really representing fatigue well. And obviously the elephant in the room is you can't easily validate to a fatigue property. So I think that's going to be a continued progression in the field, and it really does affect both cost and your submission strategy. And I think the FDA is open to feedback and improvements in the field. And I think the more people take the lead in saying, all right, here's probably a better way, and drive that discussion externally, the better off we're all going to be, and better off patient options are going to be. So yeah, I guess my advice for anyone starting off on this journey is get very familiar with the FDA AM guidance, become experts in your particular process. Dig into the new ASTMs that are being written, in large part driven by the FDA representatives, to help our industry have better guidances for how to tackle things. And there's like the recent F3604 validation guide from ASTM on how to validate our processes, and the new test methods for like a lattice coupon. All those might be helpful. But yeah, I guess the takeaway here is really understand your process and how your process window can affect your device function.
Shailesh, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we are working with a particular customer whose implant is going through FDA review, and kind of echoing what Trey said, is that what we're finding is there is a heavy focus on validating material properties and device properties, especially fatigue, under worst case conditions. So the lattice side of it was fairly straightforward. There are, you have requirements: porosity, pore size, thickness, abrasion resistance, shear strength, shear fatigue. All of those things are very well established. And, at Orchid, we have a lot of experience over many, many years on doing that level of characterization. But the focus has been mostly on the mechanical properties. How do you use a witness coupon to justify that you have actually tested worst case for, say, fatigue of the tibial base plate, as an example, right? While lattice structures, it almost seems like, if it meets those consensus standard requirements, the FDA didn't have a lot of questions related to that. Again, because some of the structures are essentially mimicking what was done in the past. There's nothing dramatically different, similar to what not what's his name? The esoteric structures do require different levels of testing. But if it's something that's not quite as esoteric, then the consensus standards are good enough for getting clearance, it would seem.
So something I think I find pretty fascinating about this, and some of the back and forth that I've had with FDA even recently, is I think a fallback for process validations, this verification and validation and this worst case discussion are kind of this fallback to say, well, I'm testing my material state with every build. So in other words, I understand here's my material state. When I build it, I know exactly what that is. Fatigue issues notwithstanding, that's a separate issue that Trey already touched on. What's interesting about the guidance document is it does not force users of AM machines to build test coupons with every build. It just says if you can't validate it, you must verify the material state. And so this idea about understanding variability across a build used to be hard 10 years ago. Now it's all the machine manufacturers run these studies because they realize the value in proving to the end users how important it is to understand mechanical properties being consistent across a build plate. So when you talk about worst case, it's like, all right, well, the FDA, what I've seen them do, unfortunately, is say when you submit your parts, well, what was the reuse cycle? Okay, you can't run any more than that reuse cycle. What was the tensile values? Oh, well, you were 10% above. Now no builds can be below this. And it's like, well, what's the point of having a recognized consensus standard, FDA, if you can't, go to the minimum requirements, right? I'm certifying to this classification and your recognized consensus standard. And I think it's just this fact that there's just not enough information out there, and it's not being provided by the sponsors because the contract manufacturers either haven't seen this type of question before or haven't gotten good at answering the questions in a way that make the FDA happy. And so if you can show them, okay, yeah, my variability across my process is less than 5%. I've got X amount of data over this amount of time, or hey, I've run my own variability studies for fatigue, and you can kind of see where we're at here. Then I think the FDA is happy with that, because if you look at wrought titanium, wrought titanium certs ASTM F86 is just minimums, the exact same as F3001 for laser powder bed fusion. Nobody ever asks when you submit a traditional machine product, what does your wrought titanium cert come out at? You just say, I met F86. But if you actually look at the variability of certs, you'll find that a lot of the times they're plus or minus 10%, exact same as what you're seeing out of AM processes that are producing a material state. I just think that is fascinating. It goes to show you that the FDA does not have all the answers, but additional clearances and pushes by research that I think Zimmer, Trey, you guys are doing a great job there presenting the data. FDA themselves present multiple papers at ICAM because they're also doing their own studies. So I think being involved in the research, sharing the research so that everyone can sort of take a look at it and say, okay, here's this new standard. It is possible to run an AM process with this amount of precision. Therefore, there are no major concerns that one build's going to be great, the other one's just going to explode inside of a patient. And I think that's what the worry is consistency. So my 2 cents.
Yeah, kind of echoing on that a little bit also is that what we have found, because we are also a forging vendor, right? So we have access to a lot of forging data. And then we can make a comparison directly with additively manufactured material properties. So there may be some slight differences in the structural tendencies, say of tension strength or the yield strength of the material. But what we're finding is the difference in the variability of the data is much greater for the traditionally produced product, right? So forgings have a much greater low values and high value. The range is much greater than we would see in additively manufactured, even though the central tendency itself might be slightly lower, depending on the modality you end up using for additive manufacturing, might be a little bit lower. The variability is so much greater for a traditionally manufactured product. Yeah. So I think that's one other advantage of additive printing also. just making sure that all locations, all orientations are properly accounted for. And that's what the FDA is really looking for.
Thank you for all that information. We have just a couple of minutes left, and so there's some questions from the audience I'd like to throw out. How have cleaning processes improved to prevent foreign material from getting embedded in porous structures or getting it out once it has been embedded? Could someone take that?
So there are traditional, mechanical means of removing contaminants, right? So in powder bed fusion, you also have unsintered powder that is sitting into the lattice, right? So there, what we're seeing is that the ultrasonic cycle times and the frequencies are unique and longer actually to remove that material, because that material is there by design in the 3D printed parts, while it wouldn't be there for, say, a sintered coating, right? So what we're also doing is we're looking at other methods like vacuum-assisted ultrasonic cleaning, right? So that what we found is that access of the cleaning detergent to the deep into the lattice structure is just as important as the mechanical means by which you're removing it, right? So if, for instance, your detergent cannot get into the lattice structure, then it's not going to, whether you use ultrasonic or you don't, it's just not going to be able to pull that material out, right? So that is a clever utilization of proper surfactants and things like that, is where ability to remove unused powder from lattice structure is very important.
Yeah, echoing that, it is an area of concern from the FDA, and I think that's warranted because you now have the lattice from the beginning of your process. So any contact materials in your manufacturing process, you have to also be able to remove. So we have a variety of ways to remove powder. But I think stay paying attention to the standards development, because right now that's an active discussion in the community of standards of how do you prove that you've gotten enough powder out. And that's not simple, because you can ultrasonically clean the substrate off of itself. Like if you keep ultrasoning it enough, you'll start stripping it. And so where do you hit that asymptote and say with confidence that nothing's able to come out biologically, or whatever can come out has an equivalent safety profile from a predicate device?
Thank you. Shailesh, you were talking about gradient. Could a gradient porous structure impact fixation? Someone wants to know.
Well, so I think in a knee implant, let's take a tibial base plate as an example, or even a knee femoral component. Ultimately, the mantra is that short-term fixation is a good predictor of long-term fixation. So if you have a loose implant to start with, it's not going to become unloose over time, right? So initial fixation is very, very important. So then the question becomes, in order to get that initial fixation, where do you need the greatest amount of press fit and the roughness, right? In areas where you don't need it for either surgical technique reasons or stuff like that, provided you don't end up getting micromotion at the interface between bone and the lattice structure itself, then I'm not suggesting that it's not important, but the primary fixation that comes from other side of the implant may be just as important, if not more important, right? So for instance, if the entrance to the anterior flange area where first bone contact can potentially take place is a little bit smoother than other areas, but it doesn't give you the press fit, then the roughness won't matter. The roughness is really there for that initial fixation and only that initial fixation. But if your lattice structure is the same otherwise, then long as there is no motion between the bone and that location of the implant, you should be able to get good bony ingrowth.
So I think beyond the initial fit are also this idea of the stiffness mismatch. And certainly, at least in spine orthopedic products, the advent of PEEK was primarily because metals were deemed too stiff and were causing issues, especially with the adjacent levels. So what I think is pretty fascinating, and I'm currently actively working on a project which is looking at tumor resection of long bones and being able to put an implant and have the bone grow and sort of coalesce in is really different for a bone that's going to be loaded like that. So because we can take this idea about computational design as we can model the stresses that are in the bone at that location, then we can model the effects on the lattice component. And then we can directly change the gradient and the morphology of the structure to tune the response so that the, as the implant and the bone together as a composite basically are seeing load, you're not getting a gigantic mismatch of stiffness, which causes a cascade of issues down the line. So that's just one example. I think the question I always have is how much space do we have to work with? For a tibial base plate, there's not a ton of space to play with the lattice because of strength requirements. So the thought is, can you properly grade into the solid in such a way that allows you to augment or take advantage of a different stiffness? Or are you primarily, like what Celeste is saying, just primarily interested in the initial stability of the implant for long term? So those things I think remain to be seen. There's still some research to be done on, like I said, which lattices are better. Is any lattice okay, or are there specific lattices for these particular applications that provide a direct benefit that we see?
Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. We're reaching the end of the event. So thank you, Celeste, Trey, and Matt, for the great presentation and discussion. We appreciate you being here and sharing your perspective and expertise. Thank you to the attendees. I hope you took away valuable and insightful information. You can learn more about Orchid Orthopedic Solutions at orchid-ortho.com. An on-demand version of this webinar will be published at bonezonepub.com, and you will all receive an email when it's available to watch. With that, I hope you all have a great day. Thanks again for coming.